This evening, Books and Books, in collaboration with the University of Miami Center for the Humanities, is very happy to welcome Professor Nicolás N. Patricios and his new book, The Sacred Architecture of Byzantium, Art, Liturgy, and Symbolism in Early Christian Churches. And here to introduce Professor Patricios, please welcome to the podium a good friend of Books and Books and the director of the Center for the Humanities, Professor Miyoko Suzuki.
Thanks so much, and thanks again to Books and Books for hosting us again. And I'm very happy to welcome you to another standing room only event, book talk at Books and Books. Tonight we have the pleasure of presenting to you someone outside of the College of Arts and Sciences, which is where the Center for the Humanities resides, but we actually celebrate and promote humanities scholarship across the University of Miami. Tonight we have Nicolás Patricios, who was a distinguished Dean of the School of Architecture, a practicing architect, and tonight he speaks to us in his capacity as a historian of architecture who was the author of this impressive tome, The Sacred Architecture of Byzantium. And I also have the pleasure of introducing his successor as Dean of Architecture, Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg, who will introduce him tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. What a great kind of partnership between the humanities and architecture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Nick Patricios. Thank you. To introduce Nick Patricios this evening, architect, planner, historian, author, and longtime faculty member of the University of Miami School of Architecture. In 1983, as the school's first dean, he gave the new school its well-begun impetus. After stepping down from the deanship, Nick remained an engaged and watchful faculty member looking out for the long-term well-being of the school and its faculty and students. During that time, he also set an example for the young faculty with a steady engagement with research and publication. You may know his other books, Marvelous Miami, and Kefalinia and Ithaki, a historical and architectural odyssey. Retiring from full-time teaching allowed Nick to travel for research. In recent years, he has been a Fulbright Fellow in Greece and a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome, 2 honors that are part of a long lifetime list of scholarly awards and recognition. If I were to go through them all, because I have them on a resume, this would be more of an Italian affair in which the introduction would be longer than the speech. So given the topic, I will not do that, but suffice it to say that he continues his academic and professional initiatives in the US and Greece, and we might expect more awards in the future. When Nick came to my office several years ago to tell me about the topic of the book that is the topic of tonight's talk, I couldn't believe that this was an area that was not already well documented. So it's really wonderful to see that the book has been produced and published. The subject is one of great beauty, and we can all look forward to a wonderful experience this evening. Nick?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here this evening. I see a lot of friendly faces, so thank you for your support. Thank you also to the Center for Humanities at the University of Miami for arranging this talk, and also to Books and Books for hosting this talk. The book has 7 chapters in it, 2 chapters on architecture, 2 on Byzantine art, 1 on the liturgy, Eucharist liturgy, 1 on symbolism, and the first chapter is on church and state, which sets a historical framework. Starting with the history, let's see. I've got to point it. Okay, thanks. The year 313 was one of those watershed years. An event occurred in that year that changed the course of Western history. It's one of those if occasions. If that event didn't happen, we would be a completely different world today. What was that event? That event was the issue of the so-called Edict of Milan by the co-emperors Licinius and Constantine that recognized officially the religion of Christianity, which is very significant. Because up to that time, Christianity was illegal since 64 from the time of Nero. And of course, Christians had been persecuted. So from now on, Christianity is illegal and persecution stop and all properties are returned to the Christian. Constantine is regarded as the first Christian emperor. What physical evidence do we have for that? I do have some evidence for you. The three Roman coins minted between 330 and 350 of the current era in Constantine's era. Of course, they're very small for you to see, so I've enlarged them. And as you could see on over here on the reverse, there is a Christian symbol known as the Christogram, also known as the Chi Rho symbol, which are the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. His son and successor, Constans, made this Christian symbol more prominent by placing it on the labarium, or the military standard of his army. In fact, every emperor after Constantine was Christian, except for Julian, who reigned for only 3 years. In the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius issues the Edict of Thessalonica, and in that edict, he makes Christianity the official and sole religion of the Roman Empire. That is significant. Within a span of 70 years, Christianity goes from being illegal, persecuted, minority, to being the sole religion of the whole Roman Empire. You need to recall at that time the Roman Empire was a huge area covering southern Britain, the whole of Western Europe up to the Rhine and Danube, the Asia Minor, the Near East, and North Africa. When Constantine died, you'll see the death wreath around his head, but on the reverse, he's shown as the Sol Invictus, the Roman god of the sun, riding a quadriga or a four-horse chariot, riding up into the sky. But what is significant about this is that little symbol on the top there, the Manus Dei, the hand of God coming down and taking Constantine up into heaven. Remarkably, a century earlier, Christ is shown in this mosaic in the Julii temple in the Vatican necropolis, also as the sun god Helios riding a quadriga up into the sky, into heaven. So Constantine, as the first Christian emperor, builds the first public church, and that is in Rome, the Basilica Constantiana, much changed in the Renaissance period, and known today as the St. John Lateran. The term basilica is an architectural term that comes from a type of Roman building which Christians adapted for church use, which is a central rectangular hall terminating in a semicircular apse with an arcade separating the nave, the central space, into two aisles, usually one aisle on each side, but in this case 2 aisles, and also clerestory windows. The second church he built was the old St. Peter's, which is now replaced by the current structure built by Pope Julius II in 1506, also in basilica form. Okay, so if these are the first 2 Christian churches built in the early 300s, what did Christians do for the first 300 years since the death of Christ in about the year 30? They used to meet in private houses, and when their congregation grew, they would convert a whole house into what's called a house church. And this example of one in Jura Europos, which shows an assembly hall for 50 people, a dais for the bishop, and a baptistry, and probably a room for the catechumens, and a courtyard. So for the first 300 years, these house churches were inconspicuous because the Christians had to keep a low profile. Okay, so what became known as the Holy Land, Constantine's mother Helena travels there in her 70s, a few years before she died, and instrumental in establishing the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of Golgotha in Jerusalem. In Bethlehem, you have the octagonal shrine over the grotto with an attached basilica and courtyard. And in Jerusalem, you have the Anastasis Rotunda with the basilica, church, and a smaller courtyard. This is one of 4 examples of early Christian churches in Rome that you can still visit today. I'm only showing you 4 out of 22 that I describe in the book. This is Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill, which still has the original marble floor, these beautiful fluted Corinthian columns supporting an arcade, and the clerestory windows. What becomes a feature of the Byzantine church is already established triumphal arch and a semidome, both of which are decorated. In this case, the decoration is from much later. Of course, the ceiling is also from a later period. This is an unusual church, San Lorenzo Fiori le Mura, because originally it was a basilica church, and you still see the triumphal arch, but the apse is missing because a pope later on, Honorius, added another church back to back. So it's very unusual. But the reason I'm showing you this is for this ambo, which is one of the few original ambos from that period that is still in use today. Ambos in the early church were always in the middle. There were no pews or chairs at that time. This is a very recent addition. The purpose of the ambo is 2-sided. On the one side, the lector would read the epistles, and on the other side, the deacon would read the gospel reading. This would be a typical early church, which shows that it's undecorated, except for the triumphal arch and decoration of the apse at the back. Of course, the altar and baldacchino are Renaissance, from the Renaissance period. Sant'Agnese Fiori Lemura is interesting because not only does it have a well-decorated triumphal arch, the painting being from a later period, an original mosaic in the apse, but we have galleries which sometimes appear in some of the early churches. And you will notice that the columns supporting the arcade are all different. That is because they were using columns from old Roman buildings. But now there's something else you probably notice. They're all different colors. Whereas in Greek buildings, ancient Greek buildings, they loved white marble or white stone. But the Romans loved variegated marble. So you have all this variegated marble in the columns of Sant'Agnese. So this is the Byzantine mosaic in Byzantine manner, showing Sant'Agnese probably on a funeral pyre because she was burnt at the stake. Pope Honorius holding a model of the church, and Pope Symmachus, who had built the earlier church. This is the starry firmament, and this is the hand of God again appearing. Thessaloniki today is the second largest city in Greece, but in the Byzantine era, it was more important than Athens. It was a co-capital with Constantinople, so it was a very important city. These are two of the existing Byzantine churches still functioning today out of 9 in Thessaloniki. Saint Demetrius, the original church was burnt in 1917, but they rebuilt it completely according to the old model, and some of the original mosaics still appear on the south wall on that side. The Archieropietos is probably one of the oldest Christian churches still in use anywhere in the Christian world from the 5th century. Some of the decoration is now kind of faded. You see galleries on both sides. So besides the triumphal arch and the decorated semi-dome in the apse, a new feature appears. A new feature appears in the Byzantine church, what we call the iconostasis, or the icon screen that separates the laity from the holy area, the sacred area that only the priests or the clergy can access. So the basilica form was definitely dominant in the early period of the Byzantine history, but there were other types as well. You had the cruciform type, which is a Greek cross, that is, all the arms are equal. Constantine began this as a mausoleum for himself, and very ambitiously he provided 12 sarcophagi, 12 being the 12 apostles, right? So very ambitious that he was hoping to translate all the relics of all the apostles eventually here to join him. Eventually the church, he was very, very much of that attitude. He considered himself the 13th apostle. That's true. The Emperor Justinian completely rebuilt it and added his own sarcophagus there, and that's the one for Constantine. This Church of the Holy Apostles, the Apostolion, stimulated another famous church, St. Mark's in Venice, which is a Greek cross. Of course, it has that additional U-shaped narthex all the way around. In fact, the other inspiration was for the original plan of St. Peter's, designed by the famous architect Bramante. He designed a Greek cross for St. Peter's. Wouldn't it have been great today if that plan had been maintained, but was changed later into a Latin cross. Another type is the circular type of church. Well, it's actually a mausoleum that Constantine built for his daughter Constantina, and Julian later added another sarcophagus for his wife Helena. But you can see the problem with the circular church and the cruciform church. You have the altar in the center. Where do people stand? Where do people go? They have to be all the way around, which is very, very awkward. And another type of the centralized type is the octagonal church, in this case set in a square. The Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, built by Constantine just before he built Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Another type was, of course, there are a lot of Greek temples, Roman temples around, so why not use some of them? So in this case, you have the Duomo Siracusa in Sicily, where you see the Doric columns for the old Temple of Athena being incorporated into the interior of the church. And this example in Rome, Santa Maria Exianzana, where the spaces between the columns are filled with the walls to create a church. But the most popular church type that becomes dominant second half of the Byzantine Empire is what's known as the cross in square. You have the Greek cross set in a square. You have the Greek cross in a square and the Greek cross in a square. Also, these plans show the standard division of all Byzantine churches, doesn't matter where they are: a narthex, a naos or nave, and a sanctuary area, or the holy bema area. Sorry, I cut off the narthex there, but you have the narthex, the naos, and the sanctuary area. So from the exterior, the cross in square is very obvious. You have the cross, and over the crossing point of the arms, you have a dome, and then you have the square around that. Or this one in Mani. This is one of hundreds and hundreds of churches that you will find in Greece today. In mainland Greece or the Aegean Islands, this is the most popular church type, the cross in square. The last type that appears is the monasteries on Mount Athos. What they did, they took the cross in square, but they added two apses on the side, and they added a second inner narthex called the liti, in which they would hold special services. But what they did is do something interesting. The exteriors now became very much more elaborate, and with this beautiful brickwork. So this appears about the 9th, 10th century in Mount Athos. Now the thing about the basilica form, which is the early dominant type, is its horizontal dimension. When you enter the church, your eye is focused on, of course, the center opening behind which is the holy table or the altar. So that's the whole focus of the basilica. But then when they built churches with domes and cupolas, you have the vertical dimension and your eye is drawn up and you have this uplifting feeling. So how could you combine the horizontal dimension with the vertical dimension? They found the answer: the domed basilica, which you have Hagia Irene and Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, each built more or less at the same time. You see the elongated form of the basilica, but with a dome. And the same here in Hagia Sophia with the chamfered corners. It's interesting here, while we're looking at this plan, the plan of the third Hagia Sophia, is the ambo is in the center of the church. And then you have a scevaphylakion, which is where the church treasures were kept, and a separate baptistry. So the interior of Hagia Sophia, which I think all of you may be familiar with, of course you have this fantastic space because you're combining the horizontal with the vertical. And you will note some Islamic symbols, because after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, virtually all the churches are converted into mosques. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, but in the 1920s turned into a museum, which it still is today. So the basilica, the most dominant church form in the early history of the Christian church. In the second half of the Byzantine Empire, the cross and square becomes the dominant type. But the basilica church still built all the way through. In fact, anytime you go to anywhere in the Byzantine world today, you'll find one of these two types of churches, the basilica type or the cross and square. We mustn't forget, however, that you had the cruciform type, the centralized type, the octagonal, the dome basilica, the converted, and the Athonite. So what's the conclusion of this? There's no typical Byzantine church. Okay, well, they lavished a lot of money on the interior of the churches. You could see all this beautiful marble, polished, sparkling, reflecting light like anything, marble on the walls as well. And where it wasn't covered with marble, you have frescoes and mosaics. So the churches were very heavily decorated in the interior. Symbolism, that's one dimension of the Byzantine church one needs to mention. I devote a whole chapter 7 to it. The thing is that the church is full of symbolism which today we rarely can appreciate. And I didn't attempt in that chapter to try and interpret what the symbols in the church are. So what I did, I go back to the original texts from that time, and I use quotations from the different texts of that time to be able to ascertain what did people at that time see as symbols in the church. And just these are 3 examples out of dozens in chapter 7. Its lofty dome resembles the highest heaven. That's number 1. The broad arches portray the 4 ends of the earth. Decorated with golden mosaic, the firmament is with like shining stars. So a lot of the symbolism is difficult for us to appreciate today, but by reading the original text, one begins to get a feeling of what the experiencing the church was to the people of that time. Okay, so the original churches, very plain outside, like this Saint Sabina in Rome, but in the second half of the Byzantine era, beautiful brickwork on the exterior. Okay, what about mosaics? Okay, everybody associates Byzantine churches with mosaics. This is the most beautiful mosaic in San Vitale in Ravenna, and it depicts the Emperor Justinian carrying a gift. The tradition was whenever the emperor came to liturgy, he would bring a gift, usually the paten, that he would place on the holy table or altar. He has 3 court attendants with him, the bishop Maximinus holding across 2 deacons, one with a gospel book, the other with a censer. And interesting, we come back to the Chi Rho. The royal guard have shields with the Chi Rho on it. The church with the most extensive Byzantine mosaics, everybody regards as being St. Mark's in Venice. But to rival St. Mark's in Venice is this church in Monreale. And it's not a Byzantine church. It was built by a Norman king, William II, but he wanted to impress his subjects. So what he did, he brought a whole team of artists from Constantinople to decorate the church in the Byzantine manner. So you have every wall surface covered with mosaic. But there's a program to it. About 50 of the scenes are from the Hebrew Bible, beginning with Genesis and creation. And the other 50 are from the New Testament, depicting scenes from the life of Christ. For me, personally, this is the most stunning image of Christ, which happens to be the central figure in the diocesan composition in the south gallery of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople. So I could go on for ages and ages, so some beautiful icons and mosaics. But there's 2 points to make before, because we don't have time to do that. There's 2 points. One is Byzantine church art, iconography, is programmatic. And secondly, it's stylized. I'll show you 3 examples of being programmatic, in the sense that images need to belong to special spaces in the church. The iconostasis, or templon, which separates the laity from the clergy area, is an icon screen that can vary in width and height and level of decoration. But always there is a standard principle. The central opening is known as the Beautiful Gate and is usually decorated with the Annunciation, with the Last Supper above. This is kind of a classic iconostasis. On either side, you will have on the right side the image of Christ, on the left the image of the Mother of God, the Theotokos, as she's known in Orthodoxy, and they're known as the sovereign icons. Next to her will be the patron saint of the church, to whom the church to whom the saint is dedicated. And on this side you have St. John, the forerunner, or St. John the Baptist. St. John the forerunner, as is known in Orthodoxy. And then the 2 doors, you'd have the archangels, Michael and Gabriel. The other place for that's programmatic is inevitably in the semidome of the apse of the bema area. You will have a figure of the Theotokos holding in her lap the figure of Christ child, the Christ child, and are always enthroned. In some compositions, she's accompanied by the archangels Michael and Gabriel. She is known as in Greek, platitera, which means she who is wider than the heavens. The third and perhaps most dramatic place in the church is the central dome, where you would have a bust of Christ looking down, known as the Pantocrator, that is the ruler of the whole world, looking down at everybody. And around the ring at the bottom of the dome would be a ring of prophets. So that's the programmatic side. In terms of stylized, Byzantine art is stylized. You have to go back and think, well, that these aren't portraits of saints or holy figures. That's not what they are. They're supposed to be images of holy figures or spiritual figures. So how does an artist portray a spiritual figure? What they try and do is make it feel a little not substantial, make it kind of feeling of lightness. But certain things they do, very subtle, excuse me, very subtle. You have very large eyes, larger than normal. The idea is that they could see the wonders of God much easier. large ears, larger than normal, so they can hear the commands of God. A very narrow nose, so that they don't smell the aromas and be tempted of the real world. And a small mouth, which means that they don't need very little sustenance, so they don't need much food. And then you'll always have the right hand in the form of a Byzantine blessing. Okay, this is a beautiful manuscript illustration that depicts Saint Basil conducting the Divine Liturgy. But notice that this Divine Liturgy, is set within an architectural and artistic framework. So the liturgy needs to be considered with those two aspects. So in conclusion then, in order to fully appreciate Byzantine Church, one has to see architecture, art, liturgy, and symbolism as a unity, and then you get the full appreciation of the Byzantine Church. Some cases in literature, the Byzantine Church has been described as being heaven on earth. Where did that expression come from? Okay, some background. 987, Vladimir of Kiev, who is the monarch of the Rus people. And at that time, the Rus people covered an area that is today Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. He didn't want his people to be pagans anymore. He wanted them to have a uniform religion, just like the other people around him. So he asks some Bulgar Muslims to come and visit him, and he asks them, "What is the nature of your religion?" After they tell him, he says, "Your prohibition on pork and alcohol is not going to go down with my people. I'm sorry." So the Pope hears that he's looking for a religion, so he sends a group of German Catholics, and then the prince asks, "What is the nature of your religion?" After they tell him, he says, "Well, you know, all this fasting, I don't think that's good. I like eating too much." Sorry. So next, his next visitors are Jewish Khazars. He asks them, "What is the nature of your religion?" They tell him, and he says, "Well, I want to ask you another question. Where is your natural territory?" So they say, "Well, it was Jerusalem, but we lost Jerusalem, and we now scattered in the diaspora." And the prince says, "Well, you know, that's no good. If your gods abandon you, how can I have you as a religion? You've been abandoned." So he calls his advisors together. He says, "What do I do?" So they said, "Well, you know, the Slavs to the south have just converted to Orthodoxy. Maybe you should look at that." So he sends a group of 10 envoys to Constantinople, the source of Orthodoxy. So they come back and report. "We know not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor and such beauty as was known, not how to tell of it." And so the Russians are Orthodox today. Okay, finally, if you go to Greece today and you go to a church without artificial illumination and you attend a Vesper service, you too will feel what it's like to be heaven on this earth. Thank you. Yes, I will, yes.
Questions for
Yes.
Those early churches you showed in Constantinople, are they still there?
No, most of the, virtually all the early churches have been demolished and replaced by additional newer churches, except for the monastery of St. Studios, which is the original basilica church. So if you go to Constantinople, Istanbul today, no, you won't see any of the churches from the early period. They're all either under newer churches or being covered over or rebuilt.
When was Zakariye built? It's in Turkish, it's Kariye, the great mosaics.
Well, that was after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Muslims were so impressed with the domed churches that their architect followed that. So all the mosques thereafter followed the...
This is a church with beautiful mosaics.
Oh, that's the Savia Kora. And Kora, yes, Kora, okay. The church in Kora is now a museum. It's one of the churches that's been converted to a museum. So the narthex has two beautiful domes, with one with the Christ and one with Theotokos, and really beautiful frescoes on the wall. And then the naos is rather simplified because they've taken away all the decoration. But if you go to the Patricios side chapel, there's some beautiful mosaics in there, particularly of the Ascension is shown there. So Kora is definitely a place to visit in Constantinople to see mosaics. Yeah.
I mean, when was it built?
Well, over the centuries, it was probably 5th, 6th century and added on. The mosaics probably added on. Nicholas Maisaritis converted in the 12th century and added the new apse, and it actually put a library on the side as well. So the 12th century was probably the latest addition to it. Yes.
The small churches that you said were all over Greece,
Yes.
are they still in use?
Oh, yes, yes.
By religious services?
Yes, yes. If you go to Greece today, any village church or even in the cities, you will have a cross and square church inevitably, some small, some much larger. And yes, you have daily services there on Sundays, obviously, and then on special festival days as well. So, as I said, they're prevalent on the mainland and the Aegean, but the Ionian Islands, which is on the west side of Greece, are different. They only have basilica-type churches. So I didn't want to give the impression that the cross and square is dominant over the whole of Greece. It's really the mainland and the Aegean Islands. Yes.
Is there anything in particular that sparked your interest or inspired you to study this subject in such great detail?
I just wanted to know. I started thinking about designing a Byzantine church, and I said, well, I don't know this, I don't know that, I don't know this. So I started doing a lot of research into different aspects, and I said that wasn't enough. So I spent time in going to about 20 mosques, now converted mosques in Constantinople. I visited 16 monasteries in Mount Athos, monasteries of Metera and Mistras, and then of course the early churches in Rome as well. And having that first-hand experience makes all the difference, because I really had a much better appreciation of the scale, the detail, the quality of the materials, the mosaics, just the atmosphere, and of course actually experiencing a service in one of these churches is the best. Yes.
heard that a church in Venice, in St. Mark's Square, called the Basilica de San Marco.
Yes.
But from what you said, I think I misunderstood you. It's not a basilica.
It's called a it's a little confusing. We use the word basilica as an architectural term, but the Catholic religion, and to some extent the Orthodox, use the word basilica to designate a certain church, usually where there's a bishop or a patriarch. So there's a little confusion there. So the Basilica of San Marco in Venice is not a basilica from an architectural point of view, but a basilica from a religious point of view. Yes.
Do you see any theological differences reflected in the art and architecture of Byzantium compared to Latin Christendom? I was reading a book on original sin, the doctrine of original sin and Western thought, bringing it back to Freud, and the author makes a comparison between the Augustinian view, which is very negative about human capacities apart from grace, and argues that in the East there's a more positive view of kind of deification against the possibility. Is that reflected at all, the difference?
Absolutely. I think there are very distinct differences. First of all, there's the programmatic difference that, as I mentioned, in the Byzantine church, there's a definite scheme of where images will appear in certain spaces or certain structures. So that's one thing. In the Western church, the images are kind of random. There's no scheme of where they go. So that's the first point. Second point I mentioned, the Byzantine images are stylized because they're trying to depict spiritual figures and trying to, for the person looking at them, is to feel that they that figure can intercede with them with God. So it's they're kind of messengers, or that they see them as spiritual figures. They're not portraits. Whereas in the West, slowly over time, especially with the Renaissance, the religious paintings became very naturalistic and realistic. So there was a difference that in Western art, the religious art tended to be realistic and naturalistic, whereas in Byzantine it hasn't changed for 1,000 years, has remained depicting spiritual images for the edification really of the congregant. Okay.
Is there any link between the architecture and the art and everything in the Orthodox teaching of theosis?
Theosis, well, you mean the ascension of Christ?
Deification?
The deification?
Yeah, like is there anything in the architecture and the art that relates to that? As far as I know, that's the central teaching.
Well, Father Gustavo, I think, would be.
Well, Dr. Patricios explained it very well in architectural terms, but basically, the entirety of the Byzantine Church is a manifestation of making the reality of heaven and earth present to those there. That's why you have the dome, and you have the altar area, which is a representation of heaven. You have the nave area, which is a representation of earth, and the iconostasis, which you mentioned a couple of times, which is the dividing wall between clergy and laity. Really, it's really more than that. It's the meeting point of heaven and earth, because that is where the communicants receive communion. That's where theosis takes place. We become like God. We enter into heaven. It is all an elevation towards the heaven, and that is the design of the architecture, is to bring that.
Put that out, yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to say, in case people didn't know, there are actually a number of Orthodox churches in Miami. There's 2 Greeks, 1 Antiochian. They're just down the road here, or just off Lejeune. I don't know if you knew that, but you'll be welcome there every Sunday, I'm sure, in any one of them. And at least 2 of them have domes and are really quite beautiful in there. Yeah. St. George down the road here being one of them. Yeah. So.
Yes, definitely.
I just want to make an observation and thank you for a wonderful lecture and a great book. As a young student, I was studying Byzantine architecture and art in Athens, visiting Byzantine museums and churches, but the books were very dry. Your book is juicy. Additionally, it is a book which also deals with the architecture and the rest of the elements in there in an aesthetic manner, and it makes it particularly interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I was just wondering, in Lebanon and Tyre, South Lebanon, they discovered one of the very earliest churches.
Yes.
And in Beirut, after the war, St. George's downtown was demolished, and as they were rebuilding it, it turned out it was built on top of an ancient church before that. I was just wondering if any of those old churches have been studied somewhere, whether in the Middle East or in Cyprus.
Yes, in the book I have a lot of plans of the archaeological discoveries in Syria, the Near East, and in North Africa. But the reason why there's a predominance of our examples in Italy and Greece and elsewhere, because they've been worked on and retained, and discoveries taken place. But in Syria, I know there's some very nice examples of, say, a dome church, and some of the original features of the altar area and the solea and the ambo, but there hasn't been much archaeological work done in Syria or in the Near East. So unfortunately, it's very rich, but we don't have the work from that area, the archaeological work from that area. Yes.
Thank you for a very clear lecture you presented. You made something very complex, very clear, which I admire as a teacher. And I haven't seen your book, but I wonder if you have branched out into the painted churches of Romania at all?
No, I mentioned the churches in Cappadocia, of course, which are famous. They're all underground churches. I do mention in the book that I didn't want to go beyond the Balkans or Russia, because that would have made the book really even a second volume. So a second volume would really be needed to devote to the Balkans and to Russia, both for the architecture and the art. I mean, the Church of Ohrid in former Yugoslavia is famous for its mosaics, for example. Yes. Okay.
Who hasn't asked a question yet?
Yes, yes, back there.
Looking into the churches in Greece, especially in the Aegean, the sense I always got is like you were entering like a cave, like the light was always dark. You know? And I wonder if that's my impression, or if they thought about it, or they didn't want too much light on the church, but it felt like a womb, like you enter a womb.
Yes, I mean, they could have made the windows very much larger to have more light, but it's deliberate to keep the windows small. I don't know if you could see perhaps without the light, but you get the feeling from this image that it's deliberate, that you want to come in from the outside world. You come into the narthex, which is a transition area, and then you work into the naos, which is supposed to be a metaphor for the earth, and that you're supposed to be looking up into heaven, which is the dome. So you need to change the whole atmosphere and lighting conditions. So that's one reason for keeping it fairly dark. But the other reason is that gold glitters. I mean, it's remarkable when you're sitting in a dark church, and as the light changes, you see these little spots of gold lighting up particular areas. So it's magical. So I think it creates a magical experience, really, a religious experience.
Yeah. It does. Even in the very small churches, you feel very different from the outside.
Right.
Because, you know, in the Aegean, there's so much sun, and if you go into the small church, and it was just so different.
Yeah, Father, you.
Dr. Patricios, something that caught my attention was at the very beginning of your presentation. We were talking about the house churches, and you showed a diagram, and you showed the assembly area and the dais for the bishop. And I assume that this comes from archaeological remains. Is there any evidence of there being? I noticed that there wasn't a fixed altar. Is that a feature that came into existence as far as having a fixed altar area after the legalization of Christianity, or the house churches, since they had to meet clandestinely, was it more of a
yes, it's a very rare example to have evidence of a platform, which is the beginnings of the sanctuary area in the Byzantine church. In some of the examples I have in the book, particularly from North Africa, because the remains have been so well preserved, you can actually see the foundations of an altar area, or solea, or the iconostasis. So the archaeological evidence is very clear there. And in the house at Europos, the baptistry area is where you have images that are Christian. So there's no doubt this was a Christian structure, because they discovered a synagogue down the road. So they knew this was a Christian church because of the baptistry, the font, and the images in that room.
Okay, so I think we're out of time for the official question and answer period, but you're welcome to come up and ask Dr. Patricios any further questions. His book is on sale over here at the counter, and he will be signing the books over there. Please join me in thanking once again Dr. Patricios.